This Tuesday afternoon, February 18th. And this afternoon, we're going to hear from a number of individuals related to or regarding the fiscal year 2026 budget, and specifically the Access to Justice Coalition. We'll start with Justice Carroll. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me and us. And I'm sorry I have something in my mouth, but Representative Lalonde saw on a Zoom meeting this week what happened when I didn't have a cough drop, which was have a raging coughing attack. So I figured I'd be safe. I don't want to take a lot of time because the people who are sitting here have a lot to say and are really down in the trenches of what's going on with access to justice in the state. But thank you for having us here. I'm the chair of the Access to Justice Coalition, which was created and established by the Supreme Court in 2004. Its mission is to encourage and promote access to civil justice. As you know, most individuals in the criminal courts have the right to have an attorney and sometimes and often paid by the state, but that's not so with respect to civil justice issues. The coalition is working to promote collaboration among Vermont's major providers of legal services. Those include Vermont Legal Aid, the Vermont Bar Association, Legal Services Vermont, the Vermont Law and Graduate School, and others who are other entities that participate in the coalition. Each of them have established several programs that provide legal services to Vermonters, but more are needed at this time. You may have seen a study that the Vermont Bar Foundation commissioned Supreme Court financed in fall of 2019. It was an economic impact study of the effects of legal assistance programs in Vermont. It concluded that legal service groups, and this was from an outside entity who is a consulting firm who does this kind of work. It wasn't done in-house. The study concluded that legal service groups provide direct benefits to their clients through greater access to the legal system and their rights, helping individuals to defend their rights and to make meritorious claims. But they also provide indirect benefits to Vermonters in the form of substantial economic return to the economy. The study concluded that for every dollar invested in Vermont low-income legal services, the state and Vermonters see a return of $11. And we have a copy of that if anyone would like to see that study. As a trial judge for 17 years before joining the Supreme Court, I witnessed daily individuals without legal services appear before me, and they were at a severe disadvantage. And when you're a judge, you can answer questions and ask questions, but we as judges are not allowed to assist those before us, even when they don't have legal representation. So as I said, these individuals are really left with severe disadvantage, especially when their opposing party is represented by counsel. And these are life-changing cases. We think of criminal cases as life-changing, which they surely are, but there are life-changing cases in the civil courts as well, as you know. And these are eviction cases where people could lose their homes, small claims complaints, which require a lot of detailed responses by these individuals, and very serious matters such as relief from abuse matters and stalking cases. And individuals often, and I'd say most of the time, go in front of the court without access to legal services. When the outcomes of these kind of cases can be really drastic and difficult for those that they've been imposed on. We've tried to address this problem, and much needs to be done. Much more needs to be done. Our organizations need to be funded so that they can continue to provide the existing services they're already providing, but to fund new programs. for self-represented litigants. And in today's current political climate, more and more Vermonters will be seeking access to the courts and to legal representation. You're going to be hearing, I won't name all their names because they'll tell you who they are when they get up here, but you'll be hearing from some of our providers when I'm done, and then Bob Paolini from the Vermont Bar Association will wrap up. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving us this time.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's very important work. Really appreciate it. You being here. Thank you.
Okay.
Any questions though before? No, I think we'll
Just say hi to Justice Cohen.
I will.
Who I've known long enough to call him Billy.
Oh, good for you. I won't tell you what I call him.
So,
You know what?
we'll start with the executive director of Legal Services Vermont. You identify yourself for the record and see. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sam Abel Palmer. I'm the executive director at Legal Services Vermont. We are Vermont's grantee, statewide grantee for the Federal Legal Services Corporation. So we're the entity that receives that funding, as well as a number of other funding sources that we have. Just as a caveat before I get started, I should mention that because we are the LSC grantee, we do have certain pretty limited restrictions on the kind of lobbying that I can do that are tied to that funding. But there are two things that I am allowed to do. One of them is ask for money for us, and others, secondarily, because both Legal Services Vermont and our close partner, Vermont Legal Aid, are the primary recipients of funding from the Vermont Bar Foundation. We're the largest grantees of the foundation, so that does directly impact our funding. But the other thing that I can do is I am always able to provide members of the legislature with information about what's going on. And that's really my purpose here today, is to just kind of give a lay of the land of what we've been seeing in the civil legal aid world. As I mentioned, we are one of the two kind of comprehensive statewide legal aid agencies. We work together with Vermont Legal Aid, partner very closely in figuring out what we can do within the resources that we have. The piece that we've got at LSV, and we certainly do a tremendous amount of eviction work. We cover about half the counties in the state. But the other things that we do primarily are we run the statewide legal aid helpline. So when people are looking for assistance, we're the ones mostly that they're calling. There are a couple of other avenues as well. But for general calls, when people just find themselves in need, we're the ones answering the phone. We're the ones answering the emails and the online requests for help, which are coming in these days at about 100 to 120 inquiries per working day. It's a flood, but twice what we were seeing before the pandemic. The numbers shot up during the pandemic, but they never went down. And so we're really, it takes me one full-time equivalent staff person just to read the automatically transcribed voice messages of people calling us and trying to then figure out what to do with those calls and who needs to call right away, who can wait a week or two. That's just literally just reading those messages. The other thing that we do is we run the statewide legal information website, vtlawhelp.org, which also gets a huge amount of traffic. So because we're at this kind of crossroads of everything that's going on, I think we're particularly well situated just to get a sense of what's happening there day to day, because my staff are the ones who are talking to the people who are having those needs right this moment. One of our mandates from the Legal Services Corporation is that every minimally 5 years, we have to do a statewide legal needs assessment. We have to take a look at what's happening with low-income Vermonters and their legal needs. And then try to get a sense of where are the greatest areas of need so that we can take the limited resources that we have and focus them where they're most needed. We did a study in 2019, and we just completed one in December of 24, which you have available with your materials. And we put this together. We used the same methodology essentially for those two studies. So we were able to take a look pretty closely at, what were the shifts? Where did we see things happening differently? And we looked at a lot of different data points. We certainly went out into the communities and we talked to people. That was one of our primary things. We had a series of listening meetings. Yasmin Dwidar was my compatriot from Vermont Legal Aid, and I went around various parts of the state. We went up to the Northeast Kingdom. We went to Bennington. We went to Brattleboro. We went to Winooski to talk to a lot of the New American communities. So we gathered a lot of just kind of firsthand information that way. We did some public surveys by the internet. We, ran some just open-ended questionnaires for people to give us some feedback, and that information is in the study. We also looked at a lot of data. We looked at, what cases are being filed in court. So the judiciary data is in there. We can track, where cases are being filed, but in particular, and this is actually new data this year because the judiciary wasn't really tracking this before, but who's coming into court with representation and who is not coming into court with representation. So that's really useful information that we found out this time. We looked at 211 data. What are people calling 211 about? We looked at probably one of the most fruitful areas that we took a look at was just the Google Analytics from the website. It's a huge amount of information because VT Law Help gets on average, and again, this is something that just skyrocketed during the pandemic, we're getting somewhere in the vicinity of over 600,000 page hits a year on that site. It is enormous traffic. That includes people from out of state. When you filter it down to in-state, it still is over 200,000, probably 250,000 page hits a year. People are going to the site. And what we look at then is what pages are they going to? Where are they directing themselves to get the information that they need? And then on the thing, and I think this is really the most important pulse of what's going on, is we just what are people calling us about? For the people who at least have the capacity to kind of pick up the phone and try to access the system, how many people are calling us and what are they calling us about? And every time somebody calls, whether we are able to get in touch with them or not, and we usually do, but whatever the reason that, whatever way their contact is coming in, we record it with, to the degree possible, a coding of what is the legal issue that they're looking at. So we've got a very clear idea of what people are looking for help with. And the data was resounding. It's housing. It's housing followed by family and health, but it's housing. And two things in particular that we found about those numbers, and you'll see a lot of different ways that these numbers are parsed in the study. The first thing that you see is that the overall request for help from 5 years ago, and when we did this study in 2019, we were looking at 2017, 2018 data. We did a 2-year period. For this last one, we were mainly looking at 22 and 23 for the numbers. The entire collection of just the recorded requests for help was up somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 25%, just generally collected. So a pretty sizable increase over 5 years in just people knocking on the door looking for help. Of that, in some areas things remain fairly static, but in the housing area, that increase was more towards the 40-ish%. Just the numbers of those incoming calls in that area were just really sharply up. And the shift was also interesting that when we looked at the data, 5 years ago, when people were calling about housing issues, obviously a lot of those calls were about evictions, but percentage wise, more of them tended to be about just general landlord tenant disputes. I'm not getting my security deposit back. They're not fixing the plumbing, kind of the whole range of disputes that people might have. Then this time, 5 years later, those landlord tenant general disputes were much lower in the overall percentage, much higher percentage of evictions. And in particular, not the non-payment evictions stayed percentage-wise about the same. The overall volume is up, but of that, it was about 18% of those calls were about non-payment evictions. But the for cause and no cause went way up. Very sharp increase in the calls in those areas. And I think especially that's those no cause evictions. That's what we're seeing on the ground. So, I think and certainly that's where we're putting our resources. I just submitted this morning my annual case reports to Legal Services Corporation. We have to say, what do we spend our time on? And there's a range of what we can call accountable case. But in the year, we did 1,039 cases. Of those, something like 780 were housing cases, almost all evictions. So by far, that's where we have to put our resources because that's where the demand is. But what that means is we're not paying attention nearly enough to a lot of those other areas. I've got one poor person who basically does all the debt collection cases and bankruptcy cases. Literally one attorney in the state between the two agencies who is focusing on debt collection. We can provide assistance between us and a lot of partner agencies. Generally, we can provide help when people are experiencing domestic violence in family cases. But if that's not a component of what's going on, we haven't been able to touch those cases in years. We used to be able to give a little bit of helpline advice. We're recruiting some pro bono attorneys to do like a 3-hour clinic where they can talk to 3 different people once every 2 to 3 months. But it's maybe a dozen people every 2 to 3 months that we can provide that assistance with. Otherwise, we're just sending them a text saying, here's the number to the Vermont Bar Association lawyer referral service. I hope you can get to talk to somebody because we just don't have the capacity to provide any substantive assistance in a contested divorce, especially if there's any kind of custody dispute. And you cannot find a pro bono attorney to take a full-on representation family case because they're long, they're time-consuming, and they're unpredictable, and they go on for years. Another place, if you're interested in looking at this, the Legal Services Corporation federally looks at this nationally, and every now and again, probably every 3 to 4 years, they do a national study of unmet legal needs in among its grantees. So we report our numbers, and so does everybody else in the country. Their general statistics are that every legal aid agency, mine included, tends to turn away completely at least 50% of the people who call us for lack of resources, that we just can't offer even a 1-hour consultation to people on that basis. And that for people, even those who are getting some assistance, for the legal needs of low-income people in the United States, depending on how you count it, up to 92% of those people receive either no or inadequate assistance. So we do an eviction case, we might only be able to talk to somebody a few times. Sometimes we're in court with them, but mostly not. We have to triage those resources. As I say, it's housing, it's family health care. Vermont Legal Aid has the Office of the Healthcare Advocate, and they do tremendous work. But again, the need is always greater than the resources that are available. But we're also looking at benefits cases, people losing their Social Security, people losing food stamps. We're looking at consumer cases of debt collection and bankruptcy. The numbers of unrepresented people in debt collection is something in the vicinity of 95 to 98%. It's huge. Family cases, vast majority of people don't have representation. So yeah, so there's way more we could be doing. We do what we can. But happy to provide any further information or answer any questions around what we have in the study.
Okay. You said the no-cause evictions were way up,
At least that's what people are calling us about.
right? So does your data say anything about the reason for no-cause evictions? No cause kind of says that you don't know, but I didn't know.
I mean, I think there's a lot of ways you can speculate about that. I think what we see not infrequently is that there'll be an eviction that will be both for non-payment and no cause, which means that even if the person then is able to get the money together and pay the back rent, that no cause is still pending and that you can still get the person out even if they've paid up the rent.
What went through my mind with the way rents have been going the last few years of landlords were doing no-cause evictions and then raising the rents is kind of went through my mind.
And yeah, I don't have any direct statistics on that, but certainly what's driving a huge amount of this is the economics. It's hard for landlords to make a living. It's seriously hard. And we run into some of those kind of what are essentially coded as no cause. I don't have any statistics. It's not every single case, but certainly we do see landlords in foreclosure. And then, the tenants are kind of the secondary impact of that. We certainly see places with deferred maintenance because it's just expensive. And we used to be able to, well, certainly when we have the ERAP money, we were able to help people pay the back rent. Or if they really were in a place they couldn't afford, we could try to help negotiate so that they could move out, go into a place they could afford. There's no place for them to go right now. There's no housing. So it's hard.
Karen and Ken.
Yes, I apologize if this was covered when you were introducing kind of this concept. I'm just trying to get the context of this because this is presenting as a group for the budget request.
Right.
That hasn't been shared yet. I didn't miss that.
No, people will be coming more specifically.
To talk about
Yeah,
that.
right. It's
The question I have, if I can give the question for it, is so there's going to be this budget request that we're going to hear about. And you're a member of that request. How do you currently get funding from the state, or do you
we do.
now? And how would the request, I guess maybe this would be helpful to ask folks as they come up rather than hear it after the fact.
Sure.
How is the request, which is on our committee page, going to be helpful for you?
Sure. So we get our funding, as I said, from a number of different sources. Our state funding is primarily through the money that is granted to Vermont Legal Aid, and we subgrant some of those funds, or we have an operating agreement. So we share the costs of running the statewide helpline. So some of the money that the state funds through the AHS grant to Vermont Legal Aid winds up coming back to us in compensation for those services. So that is certainly one piece of this. We get a couple of other subgrants. The Center for Crime Victim Services money comes into Vermont Legal Aid, and then that comes to us. The last time, I think, was it last year or 2 years ago, the AHS grant did earmark a specific amount of money just for us for the helpline work, which was wonderful. And I believe that was to about $100,000. So that's, that's the primary way that we get the state funding. Vermont Legal Aid is the larger organization. They have most of that, and they have a number of programs that are more specifically funded by it, but we certainly benefit greatly from that funding. We also collectively between the two agencies get a chunk of money from the Vermont Bar Foundation. And right now that is almost exclusively the IOLTA funds, the interest on lawyers' trust accounts. And that used to be a much larger number than it is now because interest rates went down and they haven't gone back up. And so that's back when I started my job, that was the two agencies together got about $1 million of that money. That's down to more in the $700,000 range. So that definitely has been a cut that we've had to make up elsewhere. So certainly, the Bar Foundation is a critical player in this. They do provide us with tremendous funding, but really they have been at the mercy of those interest rates without any other source of funding. And I think everybody in the coalition has agreed that we need a robust foundation to be able to support not only us, but the other providers and to be kind of a central clearinghouse for the various agencies that are doing this work. So that's where that comes in is this.
I can ask a follow-up
Sure.
to that. So that's helpful. So it's making up for that difference that was coming from the Bar Association. I guess a question, this is more out of curiosity. I don't necessarily have a stance on it. Why not have just more funding come into those other streams that you mentioned? Why is it best to have it through this strategy?
Because the one thing that the Bar Foundation can do is be very responsive to the changing legal landscape. And you'll hear about this a little bit more, but different agents, we're the general providers, but there are more specialized providers of different kinds of services, and their needs change, and the landscape changes. And the Bar Foundation they do some kind of general grants, but they also do annual specific grants to individual providers based on those needs. And you'll hear from a number of people who get that funding on just a 1 year or 2 year basis to respond to a particular emergent need. And that's something that the Bar Foundation can do that we are, the rest of us are not necessarily able to do. And that creates that flexibility.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just will share, I need to leave at 4. So I appreciate having the context up front.
Absolutely.
And as we hear from everybody too.
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay.
So I believe I heard you bring up the landlord tenant situation that's ongoing and a lot of calls and all this stuff. I just want to point out, and you did bring it up in all fairness, but there's a lot of landlords out there, like the tenants, seems like they always get help or there's help available to them. There's no help for landlords.
So that's not. So there are, in fact, we do, and we partner with the Vermont Bar Association. So if there are low-income landlords, and there are certainly those folks, we will do screening for those folks and refer them to the low bono program through the Vermont Bar Association. And we are, in fact, able to help those folks. Now, everybody who we can provide assistance with has to meet those income requirements.
Okay, so I appreciate that. But again, you said the low income landlord, right?
Right.
Not everybody's low income. Not all of them are rich. They're not going to hit that bar. And I'm telling you from experience, if you have a couple bad tenants, you have very good, a landlord doesn't want to lose a good tenant, right? A tenant usually is gone if you can get rid of them because they owe you a lot of money. They're not paying for one reason or another, right? And then the next thing you know, that landlord can be out anywhere, let's say $6,000 to $20,000 by the time that person's gone, right? You take $20,000 from anybody, right? And try to make up that difference when the landlord's paying taxes, whether he's paying a mortgage or she or whoever is paying all that stuff, right? Most landlords more than likely have a 1 year's lease. The taxes have gone crazy in the last couple of years. The other, which I won't get into too much, but some of the laws that have been passed that make this state so much more unaffordable and expensive that only hurts the tenant more because the landlord, if he can or if they can charge more, it's just a vicious cycle.
Right, and so one thing I can add in here, and this is a study we did based on a grant that we got a number of years ago, where when we were first starting to be able to kind of get early on help to the tenants in a situation. One thing that we brought in some folks from the Center for Rural Studies at the University of Vermont to look at what was the impact of running these programs to provide that assistance. And one of the consequences of that was that, first of all, cases resolved a lot faster, mostly with those settlements that honestly got tenants out quicker than they would have in other situations. Put less burden on the courts, but also because the cases went less time, meant that the landlords who did have representation were spending less money on attorney's fees. And so I certainly appreciate the point, but we have found that there's no value to my clients in putting landlords out of business. They need housing. They need housing. And if somebody's in an untenable situation, we're not going to say that in open court, but we're going to advise the tenants that that's the situation. We're their lawyers. We're going to tell them the truth.
When you have a landlord at midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning that's going and taking care of a drain problem and ripping apart a whole,
Absolutely.
It's and the average worker is not going to go out there and do it and all this stuff. It's being a landlord is not all what it's made out to be.
It's a hard job. I absolutely agree.
Thanks. Any questions? All right, not seeing. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
So we'll go to the executive director of the Vermont Bar Foundation next.
Sam, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Coach. Good to see you.
Sorry about that, Chair.
No, that's
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah King, and I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Bar Foundation. I'll keep it very brief because it's probably more worthwhile to hear from the organizations that we fund, and then Bob will finish us off by giving an overview of the funding request. I can say we opened up our competitive grant cycle over the last couple of weeks, and we saw a 300% increase in the amount of funding that has been requested. And so I think that is quite telling of the increase in need. I don't think I've talked to a single justice organization in the state that hasn't expressed that they are genuinely concerned about keeping their doors open, keeping staff, continuing to fulfill their mission with an unknown in where their funding will come from, and then also just, again, the increased need. We fund 20 organizations generally each year through the competitive grant process. And just for information of how the grants are decided and how the grant cycle is enforced, we have a committee of folks that are a mixture of BBF board members, but then also other folks that are outside of the board. And we receive the grant applications. It's a robust process. They submit a letter of intent, they meet with the grant committee, and then we kind of go back and forth and ask questions. And then we, as a committee, will make a decision of who we recommend that they fund. That goes to a full board vote, and then ultimately the VBF board will decide who receives funding, and then checks will go out at the beginning of July. So that's generally the process that we've done in the past, and we'll do that again this year. We try to give out well over $1 million in funding each year, which sounds like a lot, but really isn't in the grand scheme of things. And so that's why we're looking for the ability to give out more. But I think that's kind of the broad overview. Happy to answer any questions if you have any.
questions. So could you talk a little bit, you usually have one individual every year that is specifically being funded to do work, right? Is that, and what are they working on this year? I know there's usually kind of the.
Our poverty law fellow.
Thank you, poverty law
Yes.
fellow. Thank you. I forgot the word for it, the name for it, but.
Yeah, so that's one of the kind of capstone projects of the foundation is We fund a fellow, they're generally a new attorney, and they serve a 2-year term with the foundation, and we fund them, but then they're kind of placed in a law-based program. Right now, they're with legal services and legal aid, and her name's Deanna. She's amazing, and she's working on homelessness. And so all of her casework is working on that. And I'm sure you'll hear about that later, but that is one of our big projects that we get to fund.
Thank you. Questions? Karen?
Yeah, and I apologize if you covered this. Again, I'm just trying to just think about because the proposal that you have, or the request, is to provide money to the Bar Foundation to expand grants, right?
Yes.
So the other tool that we have as a legislature is just to give direct appropriations. And so, again, I'm not tied to either, so I'm trying to understand what is the benefit of this. So trying to understand the criteria that you consider when you're making those awards, of how you go about that. I know how it works in appropriations for us. We take testimony in here and we try to juggle all the priorities. What is your lens that you're looking at?
Yeah, so the Bar Foundation is the only access to justice foundation in the entire state. And I will say we've been around for a long time and are a very trusted partner with these groups. You're going to hear from our coalition today, but there are so many other organizations that the foundation works with and provides funding to. And even if we don't provide them funding, we provide them support. And so the reality is a lot of these organizations are even smaller than the folks that are here today and just don't have the capacity to be engaging and be sitting in a committee room today. And so I feel that it's worthwhile for the foundation because we've been doing it for so many years. The infrastructure is in place. We know how to do it. I would say the law community overall and these nonprofits trust us. And so that's kind of the lens that we're coming from. And our board is, you can look at our website, but everyone comes from a very different background. We have folks that are working in corporate law, working at big firms, folks that are in single practice. And so we're able to provide kind of a broad landscape of the legal community.
Good?
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. And we'll go to the Executive Director of the Vermont Legal Aid now. Nice to have you back. Thanks for being here.
Second time around. Good afternoon. Yasmin Bouidar, Executive Director, Vermont Legal Aid. As Sam said, we work very closely together as sister organizations to provide legal assistance to low-income Vermonters. Sam wasn't here last year, but to give you a little bit of background, Sam's organization is kind of like the front line that receives all the calls. And so when I showed up last year and I had a lot of data about the amount of demand for legal assistance and whatnot, a lot of that data is informed by Legal Services Vermont, who then takes those calls and they work on a portion of the cases and then they forward some of those cases to us depending on the multiple projects that we have. So the Vermont Legal Aid arm essentially receives cases and a lot of it leans more towards the litigation end. However, due to limited funding over time, unfortunately, we're not able to do the level and or extent of litigation work that we would like. And it's ended up being a lot more quick advice than we would like. We still do a lot of litigation work, but in order to try to stretch every single dollar and help as many people as we can, our services have become more and more limited. As I said, Sam provided you with an immense amount of data, so I don't want to repeat that. And I think Hannah touched a little bit on kind of what the Vermont Bar Foundation does. In some ways, the way I think about it in my mind is they kind of help you with your role. You give them a set amount of money, and then there's a very detailed application process where we have to provide them with data and essentially explain why we need the money for a certain project. So outside of the increased demand, which I think Sam talked a lot about, most of our funding is restricted, and so you can only do specific types of work. The Vermont Bar Foundation allows us a little bit more flexibility when it comes to funding. And so, for instance, sometimes we'll use that funding to do clinics. So one of the things that came up when we were doing community visits, particularly in the more rural areas, southern Vermont, what was described by some folks was that it felt like a legal desert, especially in the southern most parts of the state. And so organizationally, we're trying to figure out how to bring clinics to these areas in order to kind of help address the legal deserts that are there. However, not all of our funding sources can support that type of work. And so we rely on the Vermont Bar Foundation funding to do some of that work. We're trying presently to do more clinics in the Bennington area. And also we're talking to folks in Brattleboro. So we're really trying to bring services to southern Vermont, given the legal deserts there. But we're also looking at other areas like the Northeast Kingdom, which is where I'm from. Also another area that's in need of a lot of legal assistance. But the more unrestricted funds also allow us to do other kinds of work. So for instance, impact litigation. Hannah talked a little bit about the Vermont Poverty Law Fellow, Deanna. She's been doing amazing work with us. She works in our poverty law project, so addressing the root causes of poverty. So she's worked on some of the impact litigation. She's done some direct services work. And one of the most impressive things that I'm really looking forward to is in April, she's working on she's helping a team of our staff put together a housing conference in the Northeast region so that folks can talk about their experiences, their legal strategies in order to do more housing work. So, sorry, in addition, one of the areas that we've been trying to do more work in is consumer law, which there's not a lot of assistance in that realm. Right now, we're using a portion of the VBF funds to try to stand up a consumer rights project. Our hope through that is that over time, we can get through enough cases to build a sustainable funding stream that can rely on itself through attorney's fees. And then one of the other areas that, I mean, I'm part of the 300% that Hannah was talking about. I just submitted an application and I was very conservative in my ask. Just like when we come here, we're actually conservative in our asks because there's way more need than we're able to keep up with. But I had just submitted an application because this has been a need, but is especially now becoming more of a crisis, is immigration assistance. And I think Jill is going to talk a little bit more about that. But I think it would be helpful to expand capacity to do immigration work, and that's not funding that we get through the state, for instance. And so I made a really conservative ask to the VBF, hoping to get funding because we are starting to get requests for assistance around immigration work, and there's just not enough resources within the state to support folks that need that help. And so the VBF funding is helpful to us because it helps us address systemic problems. But one of the most important things is that the flexibility of the funding also allows us to kind of respond to whatever time-sensitive things come up. And so given changes in law, changes in policy, it's the unrestricted funding streams that allow us to be able to try to assess what the need is and then respond appropriately. And so VBF funding is actually critical to our work and critical to the work of all the other organizations that rely on this stream of funding. I think my colleagues shared a lot of information, and so I don't want to be repetitive, but happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Yeah.
You mentioned some clinics around the state that I got asked about Rutland County.
Left the map at home. Sorry, we actually had a map when we were here before. Do you know the Rutland County one.
We certainly are, I mean, we're there doing eviction clinics in court. Almost every week.
Okay,
So we're down there.
I don't doubt it at all.
Yeah, no, we spend much time in London.
You were here a year or two ago,
Just 1 year, last year.
1 year ago? Yes.
I met you all.
But I've been in this committee 11 years and I don't recall folks ever coming in and asking for money.
Oh, Vermont Legal Aid?
Yeah, I don't remember. Not that it didn't happen, but.
I remember you.
And it's front, it's front and center.
No, definitely
The
not.
needs just like skyrocketed. I mean, they already were there.
Right, right.
But skyrocketed that the pandemic and afterwards, so.
So with that, another thing that kind of surprises me is that you're not asked to come in and testify sometimes on things that we do. And like kind of a broad question, but how much of the legislation that we pass out of here affects you?
A lot of it. I mean.
Right,
Yeah.
it was kind of, I kind of knew the answer to the question, so that tells me that maybe you should be asked to come in and testify.
So we did, I'm trying to remember.
More often.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if Laura Byerly actually made it in, that we had an invitation.
She did.
Or did she actually make it testify earlier? Because we do have people we reach out to for particular things, as far as testimony. So it may have, I missed the fact that, yeah, that was somebody from legal aid, but we do try to reach out to them.
All right.
They're on one of our list of the normal characters.
So they're normally
We reach out
not
to.
listed as Vermont Legal Aid, might be one of the other organizations.
Yeah, but we try to make sure that we reach out.
Could be
when-
listed as one of the projects of the month.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
So no, we definitely have them in as for one of the organizations we constantly will reach out to see if they want to come in and testify. They don't always take us up on it.
Okay.
But but I agree. We certainly want to make
Happy
sure
to
you
receive
are.
the invitation and
Yes.
to respond. Whenever I get them, I respond to them, and whenever my staff gets them, we respond to them. Andrea is our legislative specialist. She coordinates all the legislative stuff, so we can share with you her information.
Yeah.
We could share with you the map of all the clinics, and obviously, if you would like to invite us, if you feel like it would be helpful for us to be in a room, or that there's information that we can provide that would be helpful, feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to respond.
I just feel that you need to be more so one of our frequent flyers with, we call them.
Happy to come here more often.
Yes, me. So I may have missed this. I came in a little bit late. So you don't have to answer it again if you're anybody, but I was wondering if you have a rough percentage or even an exact percentage of your funding that comes from BBF grants.
I was trying to pull that number just before I walked in here, and I failed to pull the exact number, but I can respond to the committee with a percentage amount.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I'm just curious, trying to get a sense of.
I mean, I can give you an example. Like, I know our poverty law project, at least a quarter of its funding comes from Vermont Bar Foundation. And then our other projects, percentage of their funding, like for instance, family law is the second largest area of need. That's 18.5%, for instance. And so there are certain portions of certain projects that come through the VBF. They give us a certain amount of money, and then we break it down per project. But the heaviest funding rests within our poverty law project, and then also a portion of it goes to our elder law project, and then other percentages go to different projects.
And that's information enough, really. That's what I was wondering. If it sounds like with the VBF grant, you have the flexibility to make those decisions yourself, as an entity to respond to the needs in our communities, whereas other types of funding can be more restrictive.
That's correct. I mean, we have a general application where we tell them our intention and we give as much information as possible as to the kind of work that we're going to do, but it is one of the more unrestricted forms of funding that allows us to respond to more pressing time-sensitive needs that other more restricted forms of funding sometimes don't support.
my last question, do you know how many different sources of grants, revenue you have coming into Vermont Legal Aid?
Oh. I would have to get a copy of our budget to figure out the percentages, but a certain portion of it comes from the federal government, and some of it's direct and some of it's indirect. A huge portion that we rely on is from the state, which is why we come here every year and we ask if you're able to further fund our services. And then the Vermont Bar Foundation is a significant portion of our budget. Private funding is a smaller portion, and then sometimes we try to apply to other forms of funding, but it's not always guaranteed. So we've applied, for instance, for congressionally directed spending funds, sometimes to other grants. One of the ways we've tried to kind of diversify things is through fellowships. So Deanna is a wonderful addition. She helps us expand legal services for Vermonters, but we've also been trying to explore fellowships to see if there's a way for us to bring in folks to allow us to build more capacity, since we don't have enough resources to go around.
Thank you.
So as far as the state funding, talking slightly different, actually, it may make sense if you're able to come in and talk to us a little bit about what your budget ask is this year, outside of what we're talking about with the access to justice. And I'll try to schedule something with you to.
Correct. We normally have a separate ask,
Right.
but VBF again is a one of our resources, and we also apply to them for funding.
Hopefully I can have you in on Friday if it's a time that you'll be able to come in, because we have to send in our budget recommendations next week. So
Friday would be wonderful.
yes, well, I'll have Nate reach out to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So I do want to find out more about state and also where you're concerned about the risks in losing federal funding and if there's contingency planning for that as well.
Thank you.
And so, and we could also, if you want to come in as well, or it sounds like you don't advocate for the budget in the same sense.
The budgets are fine, and
Okay, so maybe the vocal.
I mean, I can certainly speak to some of that, and again, because we get different federal funding streams, I could certainly.
Okay, so we'll probably try to get both of you, and hopefully you'll be available on Friday. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll go to the Executive Director of the Vermont Asylum Assistance Program, and just so folks know that we have a hard stop actually at 20 after, and Bob, I think we're going to probably have to have Bob Haley meet in tomorrow late. So we'll probably have you schedule you for like 11 o'clock tomorrow, because I think that looking at what we have on our calendar tomorrow is probably going to be fairly quick. I just jinxed it too. So if you could identify yourself for the record and proceed, thanks.
Thank you, Chair Lalonde. Hi, everyone. I am Jill Martin Diaz. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Asylum Assistance Project. Before I continue, Bob, is it okay if I take the 10 minutes? Also, I'll go quick.
No, that's fine. We'll get Bob back in.
To the point that was just made about proportion of funding, I'll offer context that I am the state's lone community-based supervising immigration attorney, period. We receive 1% of our funding from the Vermont Bar Foundation, but we have requests currently pending. And yet I thought it was so important to come here today and to support the coalition's ask that I took my legal supervision calls on my phone on the highway. And I'm going to do that again on my way back to UVM, where I teach to lower my salary burden on VAP. So like, just for context, it really is, I'm here because I really believe in the work that we're doing and the way that it stands to benefit all Vermonters. So Vermont Asylum Assistance Project is a startup immigration legal service organization. I originally came to Vermont as a poverty law fellow, and so I practice this area of law with the experience of having done landlord, tenant, and benefits and fair housing and other types of law at Vermont Legal Aid in partnership with Legal Services Vermont. So I'm a friend of the shop, and I was formerly on their board. And it's for reasons that predate any of us as directors that the fact is Vermont Legal Aid and Legal Services Vermont have never had immigration practices. Immigration legal service is not a piece of work that these institutions have been able to deliver as part of their programs. And the state has never appropriated funding toward immigration legal services. Immigration has become this politicized topic that I think obscures some of the dollars and cents of what we're talking about when we think about access to legal aid for our immigrant workforce. Immigrant workers are 80% more likely to engage in entrepreneurship, 80% more likely to fill jobs in sectors with labor shortages, and they're the fastest growing working age demographic in our state. The 2025 economic plan for Vermont that was just introduced last week or the week before from the Working Futures Project cited the need for in-migration as the number 3 action step that the state needs to take if we're going to address our demographic cliff. The demographic cliff is what is driving, according to the economists who study the issue, it's not my bag. The economists say that addressing the demographic cliff is the number 1 most important step we can take to address our unaffordable housing and healthcare crises and our workforce shortages. So in migration, what does it look like? Regardless of your pathway to finding yourself an immigrant worker in Vermont, you need immigration legal assistance in order to access your pathways to regularized status and work authorization. When a person has a pending claim for immigration pathways, that makes them eligible to work. Being eligible to work gives you access to a social security number and to full economic participation in our society. The fact is that Vermont's future will not thrive without immigration, and immigration won't help our economy unless those folks get legal help for pathways to permanency. Now the shifting landscape is such that immigration legal pathways are virtually impossible to pursue without assistance of counsel. And the current landscape in Vermont has really not kept up with the growing need. So we're finding ourselves unable to reach people with viable claims for regularized status who are on our intake wait list. And as a result, they're now at risk of removal, which is happening at an alarming pace. And there are folks who otherwise would have been work authorized and contributing to Vermont's economy and workforce had they had access to counsel to get their work permit. Instead, now they find themselves stuck on a wait list and vulnerable to immigration enforcement by virtue of our location in the 100-mile zone of the border. Do you have a question?
Oh,
I saw this. I was like, yes.
100 miles zone.
Yes.
Vermont.
Right, exactly. Well, because it also includes the sea border. So it is really most of Vermont, if not all of it. So yeah, we've been a lot of activity in Brattleboro lately. So there are folks who have a pathway to contribute to the future of Vermont, and we're just not getting to them. And who's the we? Vermont Asylum Assistance Project is a team of 4 legal workers. So I'm the supervising attorney, and there are 3 legal advocates who are either paralegals or pending admission to the Vermont Bar. They're mostly funded through national funding that we have been able to secure by virtue of standing VAP up with our expertise in technical assistance. We've been able to convince new funders to come and trust us investing in positions here in the state. And we partner with community-based immigration practitioners who oftentimes are kind of practicing in a community-based organization that is not focused on legal and that lacks access to legal supervision. And so, especially now, we're getting called on by a lot of our community partners to stand up and add technical assistance to the whole sector, in addition to our direct legal services, and in addition to the advocacy and education work we do. To Hannah's point, I'm one of those small organizations, right, for whom it is actually really cost prohibitive for me to be here today. And it would be really fantastic to be able to look to leaders like the Vermont Bar Foundation to champion our needs so that we're focusing our direct service time on direct service provision. We're in this position now where 50% of our funding is federal. We fully expect to lose all of it. And every new grant that we bring on, if it's through the state or other federal agencies, there's a lot of overhead and administration required that can really eat into our capacity to deliver direct services as well. We partner closely with the supervising attorney of the law school clinic, Professor Brett Stokes. He is 100% federally funded and is funded by the Department of Justice. And we understand that that funding is very much under threat as well. So we're talking about a time when the stakes have never been higher, right? The stakes being banishment. And for the purview of this economic impact report, like the future of Vermont, right? Being able to support immigration in our state and the migrant workforce integration. And the law is getting really complicated. And so it's really easy to make mistakes. We need technical assistance has more value than ever. And all the funding for our positions are about to go away. And even at this time, the state of Vermont, because it lacks institutional immigration expertise, I'm getting contacted by all three branches of government most days for requests for my technical expertise and input that's informed by the national bar associations I affiliate with. And because our state lacks an Office of New Americans equivalent, like half the states have, there isn't a state-based expert. Tracy Dolan at the State Refugee Office has a purview of a very small subset of immigrants, but there's this much bigger need for expertise. And so my legal services capacity is being eaten into by the lack of the Office of New Americans, which is also before the Senate Bill 56 this session. So I'll share, I'll stop there and make myself available for questions. But I really appreciate the committee, giving us the opportunity to talk about the need for increased civil legal aid in Vermont.
Do you work with the delegation in Washington?
I do.
The reason I ask is there's been a couple of people in Rutland that have gotten in contact with David Scher, who of course works for Becca. It is complicated.
Well, and the congressional delegation, there needs to be a matter in controversy before the immigration agencies for the delegation to get involved and do constituent advocacy. And people are not going to get their matter in controversy before the agencies without legal help. So the congressional delegation is very allied with our work and they've been very helpful, but the legal work has to come first and then we can kind of get them involved.
One of the people I was working with in Rutland, I mean, he's got a visa that's going to be running out. It's almost impossible to get it renewed. It takes forever. It will probably run out before it's renewed.
And there's a lot of workers, right, immigrant workers in Vermont who are in this position who might have alternative options under the immigration law. Immigration law has not changed. And there are pathways available to folks, but they're just not able to invoke them safely or confidently without counsel. So folks like that's where we're focusing on. This Friday, we're doing a legal clinic for folks who have humanitarian parole who want to start an asylum application to switch pathways.
Since you don't have anything to do, I'll call you the next time. Oh, how many cases a year do you have?
This has been our first year. Yeah, we were just incorporated a year ago, December 23. So we were fiscally sponsored by a community-based organization before that. Last year, I think we touched over 250 individual immigrants who were primary applicants for benefits or derivative beneficiaries. So we rely on a pro bono model. We have some in-house staff, and then we also supervise volunteer attorneys. So that they're the ones staffing the clinic Friday. It's not me. I'm just the supervisor.
I can add for context. We had a couple of volunteers with our pro bono program. We had a little carve out where we were able to help the Afghan refugees who came in. And each one of those asylum applications took between 25 to 50 hours of volunteer time to submit for one family. Well, hugely time consuming.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. So I have two quick questions. The first one, I think I probably know the answer to, but I just want to kind of reaffirm my understanding. Are most of the immigrants that you're working with currently here in the state of Vermont, or is it people looking to come to Vermont?
In the state of Vermont.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
fine.
and we don't limit ourselves. A lot of organizations are affinity based or language group based or geography based, but we are in all 14 counties, regardless of manner, method of entry, regardless of pathway. We focus on humanitarian work because those cases are typically 2-hour intensive for the very small private immigration bar to take up in the market.
Sure, thank you. And my next question is, in terms of this difference between H1B and H2B, I guess how many are like, what's the rough back the napkin math? Do you think that you're doing work on H1B or H2Bs?
Great question. I have not actually done employment-based non-immigrant benefits work.
Okay.
Because typically the employer is the person who is seeking legal counsel to say, we have this unmet, workforce need. We need an immigrant to fill this position. And so the employer will seek private immigration counsel typically to be able to bring in those workers. But what I can share generally is that the H category employment non-immigrant visa pathways are directly under threat. It stands to decimate some of our top economies, including hospitality and tourism. And what we're seeing.
Agriculture as well.
Yes, and agriculture. Thank you. Agriculture, hospitality, and construction, right? But those are also industries that are relying on underdocumented or undocumented labor. And those folks are folks for whom the immigration law provides very few protections, and they're most vulnerable to exploitation, including unlawful evictions and emergency health care. We had a client who the working parent works irregularly in one of those industries. They were picked up while kiddos were at school. School children, the teachers called me with some of their administrators from the school to ask, what do they do? Because they're now frontline responders. Custodial parent who is not detained by ICE doesn't work, and they live in employer provided housing, and now they're at risk of eviction for non-payment of rent. And I've heard 2 of those in the last 2 weeks. 2 people whose landlords gave them kind of unofficial notice. But like also if you're a non-English speaking immigrant, like, I don't know, good luck. I don't know how you assert your claim to unlawful eviction, but you call these wonderful organizations, but it's really, the barriers are just like really.
Was eviction what precipitated, sorry, I guess this is a follow-up. Is eviction what precipitated the interaction with ICE, or like what was or ICE sought out this individual?
Driving while brown.
Okay.
Remember, because we're in the 100-mile zone, it is absolutely within the purview of Homeland Security to secure the homeland and to implement federal immigration law. And so there are restrictions that prevent them from discriminating in the way that they administer immigration law, but you would need to be injured and bring a claim to seek a remedy for that. What we see is that a lot of people in our constituency come into contact with Homeland Security, and just by virtue of being in public spaces, which is why a lot of folks are currently sheltering in place.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Do you know if there's an equivalent to S56 in the House?
There's one that's in drafting. I believe it was Representative Dodge and maybe Representative Hedrick who have introduced it, but I haven't seen a short form or a number yet.
Well, we're kind of getting towards the end of before
We
close.
certainly are.
Yeah. I hope that the Senate moves on it, but I didn't notice that they've been doing anything with that bill.
They have not yet taken testimony on it.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony, and I appreciate the testimony of everybody. And Mr. Paolini, we'll have to have you in tomorrow if that's okay.
I mean, 1 o'clock, I'll be here.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all.
Thank you. Until tomorrow.